America's Cold War, Chapter 5, The Nuclear Rubicon, Part 3, The Berlin Ultimatum. The actions of the United States also received close scrutiny in Moscow. Khrushchev could see that the Americans were behaving differently. In 1955, Eisenhower and Dulles brandished atomic threats over Quemoy-Matsu, but 3 years later, they hurriedly cut a deal with the hated Chinese. That raised the possibility of further adventures. For 13 years, the West had rubbed the Russian nose in the dirt by keeping its forces in Berlin, deep inside East Germany, despite the cemented division of the nation. But this particularly postage-stamped size locale had far larger geopolitical importance. Khrushchev decided to force the issue. In November 1958, the Soviet leader declared it was time to resolve once and for all the abnormal situation in the city. The occupying powers, he demanded during a Polish-Soviet friendship rally, must turn control of the city over to East Germany. No one doubted his motivation. The island of West Berlin served as a continuing source of aggravation to the Kremlin and as a practical nightmare for its client state in East Germany. For one thing, it symbolized America's earlier Cold War superiority in Europe, when the Soviet Union could do nothing about the West's determination to remain in Berlin. In addition, it was a destination for thousands of East Germans and other East Europeans, most of them educated and highly skilled, who had had enough of the workers' paradise, and found it easy to defect to the West simply by walking into West Berlin. For Khrushchev, Berlin was a bone in my throat. Moreover, the Kremlin leader believed he had cards to play. He had committed himself over the past 2 years to transforming his nation into a genuine superpower. In 1956, he had denounced Stalinism, demanded that the USSR modernize and rationalize its economy, and abandoned the idea of immediate global revolution. Peaceful coexistence was now the Soviet policy, and Khrushchev aimed to defeat the United States by outperforming it economically and scientifically. It was a long shot, given America's vast superiority in these fields, but Khrushchev believed that in the nuclear age he had no choice. A continuation of Stalinism at home and radicalism abroad would bankrupt the nation, and quite possibly lead to a nuclear war that would destroy socialism forever. And Khrushchev made progress. By 1958, the Soviet premier had reason to believe that his nation was no longer an inferior power. Sputnik had demonstrated that. Sputnik was the first satellite ever launched into space, as had Eisenhower's trepidation over Quemoy and Matsu. Khrushchev's demand for an end to the occupation of Berlin, therefore, was not an empty request, but an ultimatum. The Western powers had to leave by May 1959, or else. The Quemoy-Matsu crisis, as dangerous as it was not started by the Soviet Union. The Kremlin's prestige had not been directly on the line. Berlin was different. Get out of the city within 6 months, the Soviet premier demanded, or face the prospect of war. For Eisenhower, the Berlin ultimatum raised the stakes of his all-or-nothing gamble. Conciliation was possible over the offshore islands, but how could he compromise on Berlin? Since the days of Truman's airlift, the United States had made West Berlin a focal point in the center of Europe. The city was the very symbol of America's commitment to European defense. On some level, it made no sense to continue to occupy a defeated capital some 13 years after the war had ended. Eisenhower privately admitted it was an abnormal situation, but there it was, a product not of domestic lobbying, so much as geopolitical symbolism. Current American policy was clear. If the USSR tried to force the West out of Berlin, the United States would respond with general war. Dulles declared immediately after Khrushchev's speech that the Western alliance depended on this commitment, for if the United States folded over Berlin, Western Europeans would no longer be able to count on Washington to defend them. American credibility would be fatally undermined. But no one in the White House was willing to question the importance of Berlin, and because Khrushchev had put forward a simple 6-month ultimatum, Eisenhower had little room to maneuver. He could not get around the commitment to prevent the loss of West Berlin, and his new military policy implied that his only answer to a Soviet move was to seize the city, implied that his only answer was general nuclear war, with both military and civilian aides now urging him to commit a concrete plan for the day. The Red Army advanced on Berlin. Eisenhower groped to find another way. In March, the British government threw the president a lifeline. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan traveled to the United States to express horror at the idea that the administration might begin a new world war over West Berlin. In the event of war, 8 bombs could put an end to Great Britain, he said repeatedly, echoing Churchill's earlier concerns. Macmillan wondered how the United States could even think of initiating a conflagration over an issue like this, when it could lead to the disappearance of Berlin. Of Britain, sorry, not Berlin, it was Britain. Surely, Berlin didn't matter that much, considering how many years had passed since the war ended, and considering it was the former capital of a nation that had tried twice to conquer Europe. If the United States insisted on fighting such a war, Macmillan said, his government would need time to remove all their young children to Canada so as to keep their stock alive, as against the total devastation of nuclear war. In one emotional meeting with Eisenhower on the evening of March 20th, Macmillan wept. But the Prime Minister had an ace up his sleeve. NATO policy stipulated that no nation could initiate the use of nuclear weapons without the concurrence of all members. Macmillan insisting that without the concurrence of the members, and without the United Kingdom, that didn't work. Macmillan, insisting that the United Kingdom could not endorse the resort to nuclear war without some attempt at a diplomatic solution, urged Eisenhower to invite Khrushchev to a summit meeting before the May deadline expired. This could defuse the crisis and pave the way to a general European agreement. Here was a perfect way for Eisenhower to escape his dilemma, except for one small problem. American policy dictated clearly that the United States would not negotiate under ultimatum. Eisenhower got around this by telling Macmillan that he would accept the Soviet invitation to convene a foreign ministers' meeting, and that he would propose a summit if there was even slight progress at the talks. In late March, the United States signaled its willingness to hold four-power talks in Germany, and the May deadline passed without incident. In that month as well, Dulles succumbed to the stomach cancer he had been fighting for 2 years. Christian Herter replaced him, but in the short term Eisenhower was on his own. Despite the absence of even slight progress in the four-power discussions, he invited Khrushchev to visit the United States. He came in the fall, touring American farms and cities, sometimes noticeably stunned by the scale of American affluence. At the end of the trip, the two leaders met for a few days at the presidential retreat at Camp David, where Khrushchev promised not to issue another ultimatum on Berlin and informed the president of his determination to cut military spending. The tensions of the previous months were, for the moment, put aside, with a relieved Eisenhower having found a way to secretly conciliate the Kremlin, and a contented Khrushchev delighted to reciprocate. The two heads of state agreed to convene a grand summit in Paris, to be held in the spring or summer of 1960. Perhaps the two superpowers could now engage in real negotiations that might lighten the thermonuclear shadow, and maybe even lead to a broad political settlement. End of Part 3.